history of hoaxes is as old as time. Greek, Roman, and Norse mythology is replete with ruses and trickery. And where would the Bible, Torah, or Koran be without a generous helping of tales of deception? Maybe not on the bestseller list. Well, we humans never really got over our addiction to conning each other, and if anything, it's got worse. So let's forget how essentially depressing that is and enjoy some of history's most creative, interesting, and successful hoaxes. The Cardiff Giant. In October 1869, workers digging a well on farmland in Cardiff, New York, uncovered what seemed to be the remains of a colossal man. The dead giant was more than 10 feet tall and petrified, apparently turned to rock by some geological process over the course of thousands of years. Its body was pale, stained and weathered, adding to evidence that it had been buried for a very long time. When workers exhumed the ancient figure and word spread, the Cardiff Giant began attracting progressively larger crowds of intrigued spectators. Sensing a business opportunity, the farm's owner, William Newell, and his cousin, George Hull, began charging visitors 50 cents each for a 15-minute viewing. Some observers pointed out that there are references to ancient, extremely tall people in the Bible. The Old Testament carries references to Nephilim, sometimes translated as giants, in Genesis 6:4. It goes without saying that this link sent some people into a frenzy of speculation and stoked interest in the discovery from across the country. But when experts turned their attention to the Cardiff Giant, holes began to appear in the story. One discovered that the figure was made of soluble gypsum, which surely would have degraded and even broken down in damp soil after such a long time in the ground. Another pointed out that the location of the original proposed well made absolutely no sense at all. It wouldn't have been convenient for the farmhouse nor the barn, and there was already a plentiful stream running close to both, so why dig there? 2 months after the discovery, under growing pressure, Hull confessed that the giant was a fake, but not before selling his interest in it to a consortium of 5 men for well over $500,000 in today's money. Hull's new story was that he had secretly commissioned what was, in truth, a stone carving the year before, treating it with acid and poking it with steel needles to make it look old. Working under an oath of secrecy, labourers brought the huge statue to the farm and buried it, only for it to be dug up the following autumn by new hired hands who didn't know what they were about to unearth. Hull was an atheist, and his motive for the hoax was essentially to prove that religious people were gullible, as well as to make a little money on the side. He had been so successful at this latter purpose that copycats got in on the act, and soon stone giants were popping up all across the country. The most famous of which was an exact replica unveiled by a showman called P.T. Barnum, who claimed that his was the genuine giant and that the consortium had purchased a fake. He was promptly sued by the consortium, who were in the hole for a substantial amount of money and presumably wanted to protect their investment. When the syndicate's leader, David Hannum, read about Barnum's claim, he minted the phrase, "There's a sucker born every minute." Finally, when in February 1870 both giants were confirmed as fakes, the judge presiding over the litigation threw out the case. He concluded, it has to be said correctly, that P.T. Barnum couldn't be sued for calling a fake giant a fake giant. The Great Moon Hoax. Before humans started firing probes into the moon and ultimately setting foot on it in 1969, people couldn't be completely sure that it was unoccupied. Different kinds of scientific observations provided evidence that it was barren and empty, but there was always room for doubt. In August 1835, New York newspaper The Sun caused a sensation by exploiting this uncertainty with a series of incredible stories describing the discovery of intelligent life there. The Sun claimed to be reporting the findings of the celebrated British astronomer Sir John Herschel, who, it said, had built a telescope 6 times larger than anything used before. In the first piece, it stated that Herschel had been able to observe trees and vegetation, geological land formations with hills, valleys and great lakes across the lunar surface. Then the stories divulged the discovery of a chain of pyramids, a white sand beach, and, as the descriptions continued, details of the moonlings themselves. There were herds of brown bison like quadrupeds, blue goats with unicorn horns, tiny zebras, and beavers that walked upright in an easy gliding motion. But the story climaxed on day 4 of the article series, when it was revealed that Herschel had spotted a species of what he called Vespertilio homo, or Batmen. The article quoted, "We were thrilled with astonishment to perceive 4 successive flocks of large winged creatures, wholly unlike any kind of birds, descend with a slow, even motion from the cliffs on the western side and alight upon the plain. We counted 3 parties of these creatures, walking erect to a small wood near the base of the eastern precipices. Certainly they were human-like beings, for their wings had now disappeared, and their attitude in walking was both erect and dignified. They averaged 4 feet in height, were covered except on the face with short and glossy copper-coloured hair, and had wings composed of a thin membrane. The face, which was of a yellowish flesh colour, was a slight improvement upon that of the large orangutan, being more open and intelligent in its expression and having a much greater expansion of forehead. The series of articles came to an abrupt end when the Sun reported that Herschel's observatory had burned down. The fire had been caused by the Sun's rays connecting with the telescope's huge lens. Despite this fake tragic event, the Sun's circulation ballooned. And even when the hoax was revealed several weeks later, it remained higher than before. The true writer of the articles, a journalist named Richard Adams Locke, didn't admit authorship until 1840, and the paper never issued a retraction. Apart from boosting the Sun's readership, Locke wanted to ridicule some of the outlandish space theories of the day, and protest the influence of religion over science. Herschel himself thought the stories were funny, at least until he got bored of credulous people continuously asking him about intelligent life on the moon. The Accidental Time Traveller. For many years, the curious story of Rudolf Fentz was a tantalising unsolved mystery. According to legend, he was a time traveller who blipped into the 20th century one sunny day in June 1950, only to be blipped out again when he was killed almost instantly. The story goes that a man appeared out of thin air in the middle of New York's Times Square. He was youngish, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with mutton-chop sideburns and a generally Victorian air. Eyewitnesses said he seemed to be in a blind panic, glancing about himself with wild eyes before suddenly dashing into the road, only to be hit and fatally injured by a taxicab. No one saw where he came from, nor could explain his look or his frightened state of mind. When his body was searched in the city morgue, officials found 19th century cash, a bill for the care of a horse and carriage, and a letter with an address dated June 1876. Among other curious objects from his pockets were business cards identifying the man as Rudolf Fentz. This was a mystery of epic proportions. How could someone appear in the blink of an eye? Why was he dressed that way? And why was he so confused as to step blindly into a busy road? Initially, New York police had more questions than answers. They tried to trace the man's origins and family history using the clues they had found, but the owner of the building addressed on the letter didn't know him. His fingerprints were not recorded, and there was no Rudolf Fentz in the address book. Perhaps most curious of all, no one had reported him missing. But Captain Hubert Rimm, head of the investigation, found an entry for Rudolf Fentz Jr. in a telephone book from 1939. Some older residents of that property said they remembered him as a man in his 60s who had moved away in 1940. Following the trail, Rimm contacted Fentz Jr.'s bank manager, who told him his client had died 5 years earlier, but that his widow was still alive and living in Florida. When Rimm traced her, he learned that Fentz Jr.'s father, Rudolf, had disappeared suddenly and without a trace, aged 29, way back in 1876. He had left the family home one evening in June and just never returned. Rimm knew that it wasn't possible for someone to vanish, only to reappear in the middle of New York 74 years later, without having aged a day. But he couldn't explain how the events had come to pass, and fearing accusations of incompetence, he never officially logged his findings, and the case remained unsolved. Ever since, the story of Rudolf Fentz has been retold in magazine articles, books of the unexplained, and countless internet forums. At least until 2001, when a researcher called Chris Obeck investigated the events and managed to trace the story back to a 1972 magazine article. The article, published as fact, was really sourced from a 1953 fictional story called A Voice from the Gallery by the author Ralph M. Holland. The events were unexplainable because they never really happened. The witnesses, Inspector Rimm and Rudolf Fentz himself, were entirely fabricated. Upon publishing his findings, Obeck was contacted by a pastor who informed him that the true original was the short story I'm Scared by Jack Finney, first published in Collier's magazine in 1951. Finney was an accomplished science fiction writer who penned classics including The Body Snatchers and Time and Again, which goes some way to explain why the story of the accidental time traveller duped an entire generation. Hi guys, I hope you like those stories. I have to admit they were new to me when I started writing the script, so I hope they were new to you too, and that you got something out of them, and that some of the twists were a surprise and you enjoyed those. Bit of housekeeping. Obviously give us a like if you can, if you get time. It's just down there to press the thumbs up button. Say hello in the comments. That's always warmly received by me. I read them all and I'll respond to them all. Do share with a friend or loved one who you think might be interested in kind of mysterious content. And, you know, just keep coming back, man. I just massively appreciate it. So thank you very much. And most importantly, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.